do men want?
Manifests itself in relationships, and you feel it in relationships, and they can be very powerful spiritually. And if that's what you need, that's what you should go for.
And she said, oh, I'm going to go do a sweat lodge this evening. And I begged her to take me along, and that was about 6 years ago.
Welcome to Speaking of Men. This is Public Access Television from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm your host, Mike Rivas. Joining us today in the studio is Edward W. Wood, Jr., author of On Being Wounded. Wounded in the summer of 1944 during the liberation of France, Ed began a journey of physical, emotional, and spiritual recovery that's lasted for 45 years. Ed is joining us today to speak about a new vision of manhood. Welcome to the studio, Ed.
I'm glad to be here.
How has your experience on the battlefield and subsequent wounding changed your perceptions of manhood?
Well, before I was wounded, I was a young boy, a young man, of course, at 19. I had the conception of manhood as being the warrior who rides in from the sky and saves the country, and always a pretty woman was around, sort of massaging him and helping on. It was a great Hollywood image I had. Mm-hmm. I was raised in a military family, so I had that image too. My father flew airplanes in World War I, and there's nothing more romantic than having a father who was a pilot of those old Jennies. After I was wounded, I realized that that concept had little to do with reality of what it was like, that all of it was a perception of war and wounding that no, it was a lie. It was a myth. It
didn't hurt.
It didn't hurt, and I tell you, man, it hurts. And I began to realize that there were other values that I had to learn, the values of gentleness, the values of compassion, the values of commitment to other people, and not just risking myself in a macho way. And I learned that from that experience.
I see. You know, you're quoted as saying that men are almost forced into power as the only solution in life. Can you expand on that for us?
Well, I think that's true, and I think it's tragically so. From the time we're young, I think most of us as men are socialized into beginning with sports. We have a team and we have to win, and the winning is a form of power, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, whatever sport it is. It begins. I started playing football when I was 8 years old, and that's pretty young. And what I remember about it, that I was terrified of the game, but I had to do it because Dad was always on the sidelines chomping on a cigar and cheering me on, and I was scared to death. I actually used to throw up Friday night before the game, and I would go in the bathroom and do it silently and then get up and be macho the next day. I think a lot of macho guys are like that. So, you know, I had this great father, this powerful man, and I was going to emulate him and be like him, so that's part of it. And it's tragically so because it never really fulfills us, and it's a terribly sad thing, I think.
Very interesting. If that's true, you know, where does responsibility lie in creating the necessary changes for this kind of a new vision that you're?
Well, I think that's the exciting time that we're in today. I think that in my lifetime, the vision of what a man is has changed. When I was born in 1924, and it was that vision I described earlier, the vision of warrior and patriarch. And by the way, I'm going to talk later, I don't think those are the world's worst values, by the way. I think they're very important things in those I want to pick up later on in the show. But the real feeling I have is that what's changed is maybe coming out of the 60s and Vietnam and our failure there, and the sense that men can be other kinds of things. And I think the remarkable phenomena of what's happened with Robert Bly is one of the most amazing things in the world. He's been in the top of the second on the New York Times list for months now. Is he tapped something that's out here. We're no longer satisfied for being that warrior and patriarch, and we're looking for something else to be. And I think that all of us men are the source of this new thing. It's up to us to do this.
You know, the effects of the absent father upon the mother-son relationship is a really much discussed topic in men's circles. Do you have some things to say about that?
Well, I really do, and these are things that I learned the really hard way in my whole life. I came from a family that was a very powerful family in the Deep South, with a large extended family, with a father and a mother of great power and compassion. And I was greatly wounded by those two people, whom I also loved at the same time. And I want to expand on that as we get into the program.
You bet. Well, before we do that, we're going to take a short break here for some public service announcements and a parenting tip from the Parent Craft people. And please stay with us, because we will be right back.
There is a mighty spirit shining out.
In Salisbury, Maryland, the hungry are being fed. In Wind Falls, Indiana, a man who learned to read at 47 is making sure others learn earlier. In Hope, New Mexico, people turned an abandoned school into a thriving community center. In Boston, Massachusetts, neighbors set up a crime hotline that's making their streets safer. From Seattle to Galveston, from Buffalo to Fargo, every day, someone in America is doing something to light up another life. But there is so much more to do. The light to do it is within us all. We only need to share it. Contact the Points of Light Foundation. Do something good. Feel something real.
Pete Sampras comes up to serve. Jan Stevenson makes the drive. A.C. Green and Charles Smith pound the boards. Marcus Allen rushes up the middle. Jay Schrader with the touchdown. There are a lot of different parts to play in the American Red Cross. Play your part.
Give lots of praise for effort as well as accomplishment. Look for achievement even in small tasks, and praise your child often. Also, let your child know that trying hard is even more important than winning.
Welcome back to Speaking of Men. This is Public Access Television coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm your host, Mike Rivas. We're hope you think about the messages you just saw. We think they're important. And we're speaking today with Ed Wood, author of On Being Wounded. And we're talking about a new vision of manhood. Before our last break, Ed, we were talking about parental relationships and the reconciliation of parent and child, and the absolution of those problems that we have growing up and dealing with those wounds.
Well, I wanted to talk about that, and to do that I think I have to talk about for a moment the kind of problem I had in reconciliation. And I think I'll read a couple of things from my book about the contrast between my mother and my father as a way of thinking about reconciliation and the kind of wounds they gave me. I'd like to read briefly. This is The Inheritance of the American Male, as far as I was concerned. I, as a man, learned that all my life I would be encircled by enemies, that reality consisted of both light and dark, the dark always far more powerful than the light, as if the meaning of my life itself came from the existence of my enemies. Our enemies set the boundaries as to who we were. We defined ourselves in action and reaction to our enemies. And I think that this inheritance of weapons, wars, and woundings of enemies is still passed on from father to son today in many cases. It lies beneath the sophistication of our machines, as we just saw in the Persian Gulf crisis, linking us today, as it did for me when I was a boy, to more primitive definitions of war and masculinity and honor. And it's an inheritance that's passed on, as we talked about power before, from generation to generations of men by little gestures and head nods and values communicated without speaking, contest on the sporting field. In contrast to that, I had this marvelous inheritance from my mother's, and I want to talk briefly about that and then talk about the reconciliation. Mm-hmm. To the best of my memory, the world the women made for their children in the Deep South when I was born, was in the 1920s, was one without violence, a haven from the terrible rage of the Southern male. For me, it became a place of enormous love and caring. My mother's roots were the King James Bible, especially the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I must have known the Sermon on the Mount before I was 6 or 7. I mastered the Catechism before I was 5. And my mother revered those words she made me learn. So I had these two inheritances, and my problem in reconciliation was reconciling the masculine side of myself, the macho side of myself, the warrior side, with this soft and gentle female side. And on a deeper level, Mike, for me, and I think this is still true of a lot of men, it is very hard to admit that one is gentle or compassionate. It's not an honored value in manhood. And you see it all, the kids who run in packs and commit mass rape, the kids who do all kinds of things that they can't admit that and I'm sure a lot of them didn't want to do that stuff. They got trapped. And so my reconciliation came finally from understanding that I could act like my mother, and I could be gentle and compassionate and loving, and I didn't have to give up what I consider to be my manhood, which is the risk and the terrific. I mean, after all, Dad flew in World War I. He went up there without a parachute, and he flew those things at 80 miles an hour, and if the motor conked out, it was goodbye, and that's a big risk. So what I see more and more is that there are wonderful values from the past as far as men are concerned. The values of risk and courage and honor and duty, and I think those are good values. But we have to be able to translate those values into gentleness and love and caring, and I think this is a very difficult and very hard thing to do. I think a lot of us are afraid to do that. We are afraid to be gentle.
You know, Sam Keen, in his book Fire in the Belly, says that one of his discoveries was that he noticed that there were a lot of gentle, loving, caring, nurturing parts of himself that he had always ascribed to the feminine side. And at a certain point, he realized that they were part of his masculinity, that he was male, and that's the way he felt.
That's right.
And, you know, it kind of leads to schizophrenia to have to deny a part of yourself. Ed, in your opinion, what would be the key elements to creating a little bit of a life outside those killing grounds?
Well, I think for me, and I have to talk both personally and then I think and I can speak generally. For me, the greatest thing was after I was wounded in World War II, I had a long period of terrible emotional recovery. I couldn't keep a job. I was on the bum. Yeah, I was homeless before the word was invented. I lived in New York City for a while and was one of those crazy people you see on the streets who didn't know what they were doing. And slowly out of that, I moved to rural Connecticut. I had 6 years with a shrink, which was an enormous help. And I began to construct something which I call and I mentioned this once before, the values of art and nature and God as ways to survive. And for me, art is the capacity and the ability to seek to try and make something beautiful. I worked a long time. I worked 10 years on this book, and I started with 2,200 pages and got it down to about 190 with the help of a great editor.
You're in a good wastebasket.
I get a great way. As I told you once, Robert Bridges said a writer's best friend is his wastebasket. I had a huge wastebasket. And to make something beautiful, and it doesn't have to be writing, it can be a garden, it can be craftsmanship, it can be anything. And another thing I think is part of it is the ability to respect and love nature. And I include sexuality in that, because sexuality, you have to love yourself sexually. And I don't think American men are taught much to love themselves sexually. I think we're taught to view women as objects of prey, really, on terrible kinds of things. And I think when we respect nature, after all, the prime force of nature is a natural force, is a sexual force. And I think that's just so important. And then finally, I think that what I call the value of God. And for me, God, and I want to read a little bit more from my book here, God is the God of compassion. And to me, it's beyond religious structure. I'm a Quaker, but it's beyond being a Quaker. It's beyond being a Catholic or a Protestant. It's the force, I think, of all of us. I went back to France in 1984, 40 years after I was wounded, and I lived, when I wrote the first draft of this book, finished the final draft, near the Cathedral of Chartres, which is probably the most beautiful religious structure in the world, and I used to meditate there every day. And I wrote this as I left Chartres. In my 45-year journey through the land of the wounded in this century of war, I have learned that compassion is all that survives. Compassion which accepts the violence upon earth, violence so deep in men and nature, compassion which is able to exist within violence and not be destroyed by the violence about it, an island of security in a frightening world, compassion which is neither masculine nor feminine, but rises above sex and gender, compassion which embraces the enemy outside of killing grounds and our rifles, compassion which always demands social justice, compassion, God's gift to humanity. And as I was leaving Chartres, I thought, settled deep into this understanding at last, the man of 59 reunited with the boy of 19, both linked to art, nature, and God, linked to our children, living by the voices of my many mothers, that voice of compassion I spoke of, no longer living by the rifles of our fathers, the inheritance of violence. I rise, roots reaching back and back and back into deepest time here in this cathedral. I rise and leave, returning to my home, my long journey through the land of the wounded at last complete, a journey taken in solitary honor. And it is that value of compassion I see at the root of being what I call a new vision of manhood. And it is a value which took me many years to learn, and many torture was passed before I got there. I believe in it now, but as I've told you in other instances, I was once desired to have power, and I sought to mention it before, and I paid a huge price for that desire.
You know, compassion and blessing, you know, the concept that someone out there should be fixing those problems that community has, that someone else is responsible somehow for making the educational process better, that someone else should be dealing with the problems of homelessness. A large part of the men's movement is to look at things like compassion and blessing and the caring about those around us. Would you like to say a little bit about mentorship and community involvement?
Well, I might say more than a little bit.
Say it? Well, please do.
It seems to me that we are in a society right now, and the only words I can use for it are corrupt. And I go back to the Persian Gulf War, which I personally consider to be a war that that just disturbed me no end, because we saw in the media we were dropping these smart bombs, and I kept thinking, they're smart, they're killing people down there. We were bombing buildings. We weren't bombing buildings, we were bombing people in buildings. And then 2 weeks ago, we had a thing on TV on Justice Thomas and Anita Hill. And I thought that in both cases we savaged people. In the first case, we savaged the citizens of Iraq. In the second case, we savaged 2 people in this country, whether they were right or wrong. And from that corruption, I think that there are many things that we can do as far as changing this society. And I really feel, you see, in contrast to people who say men are wimps, that I think that men can do an awful lot to try and do this. It's one of the great things, I think.
I appreciate that. We're going to take another short break here for some public service announcements, and we hope that you will stay with us, because we will be right back.
You may not think the gas you can save makes a difference, or the amount your whole neighborhood can save, or even your whole town. But when you see how much gas America can save every day, when we all drive just 5 miles per hour slower, it's easy to see how the little bit you can do makes a lot of difference. President Bush hopes you'll do your part. Drive smart.
Esta noche, Dolores bebió, fumó crack y se convirtió en otra estadística trágica. Pero todavía no lo sabe. Dicen que las drogas ayudan a olvidar, pero no se olvide que puede contagiarse del virus del SIDA y no saberlo por meses o años más tarde. El SIDA, otra forma en que las drogas acaban con uno.
Welcome back to Speaking of Men. This is Public Access Television from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm your host, Mike Rivas. And once again, we hope you found some good food for thought in those important messages you just saw. We're speaking today with Ed W. Wood, Jr., author of On Being Wounded. And we were talking about community, mentorship, blessing, and most particularly compassion. Ed, did you have some more to say on that?
I would like to expand on those just a little. I really do feel that the new vision of manhood we're talking about is the one who can take the values of risk and difficulty and carrying them over to reforming and reshaping this society. And I'm not talking about politics as I am, as much as commitment in community. I'm talking about issues of abuse. I would like to see men serve on boards of battered women's shelters, for example, and not have it exclusively a female function. After all, if men do it, they should try and heal it. I would like to see commitment as far as the terrible poverty problems that we have, and thinking about those, the bias that we have. We've mentioned Boys in the Hood, the movie. There was the case of the kind of commitment that I'm talking about, where the father saved the son, and across the street, Doughboy was destroyed by the violence that he lived in. And it seems to me that manhood in this way involves great risk. It doesn't involve saying retreat into oneself. It involves that I'm a member of the human race, and I have compassion in that giving to the human race. I think it's a great time for us to do that.
You know, we had the ladies from the Rape Crisis Center on here, and one of the things that we observed was in violence towards women, there are programs extant to deal with violence after the fact, but there is hardly, no one knew of any program in place to deal with sexually violent men or men with those kinds of problems before the act happened. And we're discussing and thinking that a lot of the men's movement has to do with identifying those issues, because women have actively had a rape crisis center here in Albuquerque for 20 years. That's how long they've been actually involved in trying to recover some sort of soul and emotional stasis. So let's talk a little bit about the redefining of community involvement and commitment, if you would.
Well, I'd like to do that in terms of, I think if the man is going to do that, he can't deny his own inheritance, because I really think that that's one of the things that goes on today. We hear the word of patriarchy as denigrated. We hear the words of warrior as denigrated, and I think that they had good sides to them. I think, as I said before, the warrior is the person who risked his life for a cause now. And that's, anybody who lays it on the line, I admire. It's a pretty tough thing to do. There's the concept of honor, living by one's word, which I think was clearly once part of the masculine creed. Duty, responsibility. And patriarchy in the best sense of the word, in the best sense of whether it's a female or a male matriarch or a patriarch, of protecting the young, I think is essential. And it's that sense of duty to one's children that is so important. The mentoring of others, helping other young men and boys. And God knows that's really needed today. And so all those things are involved, and I think we must really know that we have a tradition of honored masculinity that stretches back a lot of years. I can think a lot of people who gave a lot of things to make this world what it is, were good things.
If you had one word of advice, we're getting down to the last couple of minutes, if you had one word of advice for men beginning a journey today, can you think of something that you might say?
Well, I would say, of all things, be gentle. Seek outside of oneself to be gentle, to be loving, and seek within one. This is the hard one. Love oneself, you know. And I think that those words are what I would say. And I always say, just in closing, it took me a journey of 45 years to learn that gentility is perhaps the great human grace of civilization.
Ed W. Wood, Jr., author of On Being Wounded. We'd like to thank you for coming down and spending some time with us today. It's been fun. It's been one of our better programs. We'd also like to thank everyone else who's made this program possible, especially our staff and volunteers who come down and give their Saturdays on beautiful days like this to make this program possible. We'd like to thank our viewers for watching. If you'd like to comment on this show, watch for our phone number and address in the credits. We're always interested in your feedback. This is Mike Rivas, host of Speaking of Men, urging you to stand if you can, run if you have to, but don't quit.